Go ahead and open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 4. So Pastor David's still in Texas. One thing we could all be praying for is that he doesn't like it too much and decide to stay there. But what I want to talk about this morning is the very real, the very beautiful, and the very radical calling to be a disciple of Jesus. Now, if you've been in church for a while, my assumption is that you have heard the term disciple probably many times before. It's kind of one of those common church terms that we hear often. And being the fact that you're here this morning, I would also assume that you have had some sort of positive response to that calling. Make sense? But what I want to kind of do is dissect that concept a little bit today. Because one thing I also know is that often our response and our behavior is a reflection of our understanding. And if we don't appropriately understand certain concepts and identities that are given to us, we won't have the appropriate response. Makes sense? Now, if you don't know me, I am one of the pastors here at Palms. I primarily serve as the youth pastor. I also serve as kind of the resident teacher on the church podcast called Real Bible Stories. And if you listen to the podcast, you know I have a theory, and I'm going to test the theory on you all right now. It has two premises with it, okay? The first is this. There are two kinds of people in this world. There are those who absolutely love and those who absolutely hate, and there's no in between. You either absolutely love or you absolutely hate musicals. Okay? That's my first premise. My second premise is those two people find and marry each other. Am I wrong? If you want to know what camp I belong to, I'll just say this. My wife, her favorite movie is Grease. So I live and operate under my own theory. But I find my theory very intriguing, not just because it's my idea, but I find it intriguing because the same thing that makes somebody love a musical is also the same thing that makes somebody hate it, right? Like, so a musical, it takes a common problem, a very relatable situation or problem, and it kind of works through that problem or interprets that problem through, like, choreographed song and dance, right? And it has, it creates this nostalgia for somebody to where it makes life almost feel a little fun and palpable, even through problems, right? And that's often why people love musicals. But that's also the same reason you hate it, because that's just not real life, right? That's just not how people behave. I have never once been walking down the road having an intimate discussion about some problem with my wife, and then through the woodworks, a bunch of people pop out, dancing and singing to our problem. And that's never happened. I'll be honest, if it ever did happen, I'm not quite sure how I would really respond to that. I don't think you've really thought about that either. I mean, one, besides the fact that would be really obnoxious, it would be awkward. There'd probably be a lot of secondhand embarrassment. And also just considering the fact that if they're singing and dancing about my problem, that means they were listening to our conversation. I would probably be upset, right? Like, I'm just saying, it doesn't happen, right? And the people who don't like musicals, that's the problem, is that this isn't real life, right? It's not relatable, it makes us feel awkward, right? Now, no matter how true my theory is, this is what I do think. I think that's often two ways people can tend to read their Bible. You have the people who almost read it like a musical, right? There's all the spiritual nostalgia behind it. There's the anticipation, the expectation of what's about to happen and how it ultimately ends. And the danger is that when you read it that way, you can capture all the beauty of Scripture, but tend to miss the reality of the message. Does that make sense? On the inverse, what you could say is the more purist or the realistic form of reading the Bible. They're so concerned about learning the facts that you're just trying to figure out what's really going on, but you can miss the beauty. So what I want to do is really just dissect this concept of what it means when we are called to be disciples of Jesus, that we, one, understand it, but also get a deeper appreciation for the beauty that's behind the calling. Does that make sense? So if you got your Bibles, we're going to go ahead and start in verse 18 of Matthew 4, and this is the calling of Jesus' first disciples, of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And it says this, verse 18. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he, who is Jesus, saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Now, the musical-loving people love a text like this, right? Because you can almost just picture Jesus walking along the shoreline, right? And he just starts picking people out to come follow him to this great mission, and you can almost see the choreographed dance as they're falling in line behind him, right? The more realist, the academic approach to this actually creates some problems for us. Because there seems to be some things going on here that just don't make sense, right? Like people just don't seem to behave this way, right? Some stranger walking down a shoreline, he says, "Hey, come follow me," and they're immediately, they just drop everything they're doing, right? Like, let me give you an example. Like, we know Peter is married, right? Imagine that conversation with his wife after this. Gets home from work. "Hey, honey, how was work?" "It was great. By the way, I met this man today. He asked me to follow him, and I said yes. So you need to figure out how to pay the bills, and I'm going to be leaving you for weeks on end," right? Good, bad conversation. How do you think she took that? You see James and John, they're with their father Zebedee in his boat, probably helping him with his fishing business, and they just drop everything and leave him. Like, deuces, Dad, right? Like, people just don't behave that way. And what I've generally found is that when that's the case, when you're studying, that means we're missing something. But as we find out what we're missing, it turns it to be very beautiful. So I want to do everybody justice. Now, the first thing I think we need to kind of understand contextually about this text is who Jesus is in relation to these men at this time, right? We all know who Jesus is, right? I think most of you guys know, oh, this is the Son of God, the Messiah. He, saved the world. But these men didn't know this at this time, right? Who was Jesus in relation to them at this time? And if I were to ask all of you, take a straw poll, what was Jesus' vocation? I would guess that most of you would probably say he was a carpenter. Now, I would say that's partially true. But there is actually only one reference to Jesus in carpentry in all the Gospels. Who Jesus really was, his real vocation was a rabbi. And at this particular time, he was already a credible and established rabbi. We know that on a couple fronts. One, in Luke chapter 5, when he tells the story of the same story, we find out there's actually a lot of things that happened in between Jesus seeing Peter and Andrew and calling them. He, in fact, asked to commandeer their boat to preach from because there was such a large crowd that needed to hear him preach. So within the community of Capernaum where this takes place, he was already an established rabbi. Does that make sense? 47 times. This comes from people like Nicodemus, who's part of the Sanhedrin, which is like the religious Supreme Court of Israel. You hear this from Pharisees. You hear this from synagogue leaders. You hear it bystanders talking to his disciples about him. But over about 47 times, Jesus is referred to as rabbi in your gospel. Okay, so primarily he was a rabbi. The carpenter piece, it was common for most rabbis to have a trade. Because you see Jesus always moving around, right? He's going from place to place doing ministry. That actually wasn't unique to just Jesus. Most rabbis did that, and they needed a trade to sustain their ministry. Does that make sense? So he was a carpenter, like he did know that trade, but primarily he was a rabbi. And these men would have easily recognized him as such, both in terms of community, the way he actually probably dressed. He was an established rabbi. But even deeper than that, not just him being a rabbi, what Jesus would have represented to these men wasn't just a religious prestige with him, but the rabbi was the Jewish ideal. He would have been represented the ideal of Jewish identity, what it meant to be a son of Abraham. If you were to ask any Jewish boy in the first century AD Israel, and you asked them, what do you want to be when you grow up? They would have undoubtedly told you they want to be a rabbi. You ever have that talk with your kids, right? Like my youngest son, Ollie, a couple weeks ago, we had a very long and serious conversation because he was very concerned about what he had to do to become an astronaut. Very concerned. He is 7. Very concerned of what he needs to do to be an astronaut. So you go through like, well, you got to work hard and you got to do good in school, and you go through the whole checklist, right? If you would have asked a Jewish boy in the first century, what do you want to be when you grow up, he would have undoubtedly said a rabbi. It was the highest position within their society. Beyond the religious prestige, it also came with certain political authority. It was a very attractive thing to be to a boy in Israel. So he was, Jesus wasn't just a rabbi, but represented the whole Jewish ideal to these men. So this isn't just some stranger walking along a shoreline, is my point, okay? But there kind of comes this question, though. If a rabbi is the ideal, then who are these men? And it tells us, right? Verse 18, it says that Jesus saw him casting a net into the sea, for they were what? Fishermen, right? So it tells us they were fishermen, but if a rabbi is the ideal, why are they fishermen? See what I'm saying? So track with me here, because this is I want to build this up, because once you understand this, I think you're going to understand the calling to discipleship a little bit better, okay? So track with me. From the ages of about 5 to 10 years old, every Jewish boy would attend synagogue, and he would attend the school of Torah. And at the school of Torah, what you did in that time is that you committed to memory, from beginning to end, verse by verse, all 5 books of Moses. So that's Genesis through Deuteronomy. The first 5 books of your Bible, every Jewish boy would commit to memory, verse by verse, the entire Torah. Okay, so if you ever think about, whenever you hear the idea of oral tradition, right? The fact that they were oral then, this is what it was. Most households didn't have like scrolls and a Bible in their home. So they had to go to synagogue and memorize it if they wanted to take it home with them. Does that make sense? So 5 to 10, every Jewish boy would go to Torah school. Now, depending on how you did in that school, if you were a top performer, the rabbis would then invite the top performing students to continue on education in the school of Talmud, or it's also called school of the book. But essentially what you would do in that time, from about 10 to 13, is that you would memorize the rest of the Old Testament. So you learn the first 5 books, and then you end up memorizing the rest of the Old Testament. Same thing, if you are a top performer within that school, you would then be invited to go to another school called the School of Midrash. And at the School of Midrash, you would, after memorizing the entire Old Testament, you would then memorize all the commentaries, all the interpretations of all the rabbis and sages, past and present, on the Bible. And you would memorize that. You guys tracking so far? Okay? This was the path, okay? Upon graduating School of Midrash, the Midrash student would go seek a rabbi and ask to be his disciple. Okay? You with me so far? He would go seek a rabbi, ask, can I be your disciple? The rabbi would then conduct a very formal interview of the student. Now, this is going to sound very complicated, because it was. Okay? It was a very difficult interview. There was a lot of nuances in the interview. Essentially, like a couple examples, like the student couldn't answer a question directly. You had to answer a question with a question. So if you were to ask me what's 2 plus 2, I would have to respond something like, well, what is the square root of 16? Or what is 8 divided by 2? Right? That's how they had to respond in answering their questions. They would throw in these little traps, or like trick questions in there. Like they would say something like, what are the 3 Deuteronomy references in the book of Obadiah? And then the Midrash student would have to respond something like, well, which 3 references? Because there's really 4 references to Deuteronomy in Obadiah. Does that make sense? Now, it was a very difficult interview. Now, depending on how well you did in that interview, you would hear one of 2 phrases, okay? If you did well, and the rabbi deemed you worthy to come be his disciple, he would give the very ceremonial phrase, son, you know Torah, you know Talmud, and you know Midrash. Come follow me, be my disciple, and spread my yoke. Okay, that was the affirmative, ceremonial, rabbinical response to accepting a disciple. Okay, now, if you didn't do well, if you botched the interview, or maybe you weren't a top performer at any of the schools in this process to be a disciple, you heard something different. What you heard was, son, you know Torah, but you cannot be a disciple. Go home, learn a trade, honor Torah, and raise men better than yourself. That's what they were told. So when we look at Jesus as a rabbi and representing that Jewish ideal, what we, one, get clued in on is when it says they were fishermen, it's not just that they were fishermen. These were men who at some point in their life had been told, you are not good enough to be the Jewish ideal. You are not good enough to be the ideal son of Abraham. You guys with me? In other words, to say that they were fishermen also assumes that they were rejected men. These men were rejected men to the ideal of what they always wanted to be. Excuse me. So with that stated, I don't know if you guys have ever really thought about this, but have you ever thought about how much rejection or the fear of it governs what we do? Right? Have you ever thought about that? I think we've all had an experience. I know we have all had an experience of rejection in one form or the other, right? Maybe you got the rejection letter from a university that you wanted to study at. They tell you essentially, you're not good enough to come study at our school, right? Maybe you were cut from a high school sports team because you were not good enough to be a part of that team. Maybe you had that job interview and you get the phone call that you are not good enough to come be a part of our company. Or, men, have you ever been rejected by a woman? Right, yeah? Hey, I'll be honest, I got my wife's number the first weekend I met her. And I could just leave it at that and sound awesome, but that wasn't the reality. We didn't talk much that first weekend, but I liked her, and I wanted to get her number. But that fear of rejection is very real. I wanted her number, but that fear of being rejected by her was enough to keep me away. I said, it's not worth the risk, right? It wasn't until a mutual friend called me and said, hey, yeah, I just talked to Trisha. She's very disappointed you didn't ask for her number. I'm like, really? Is she there right now? He's like, yeah, she's right next to me. I'm like, hey, put her on, right? And then I asked for her number, right? It was once that risk and that fear had been removed that I had the courage to go ask for the number, right? But it's a very real thing, rejection. Now it could get even deeper than that, where you felt rejected by a parent. Maybe mom or dad left when you were younger, or maybe they were around, but you just realized mom and dad, like I wasn't their priority. I was rejected by them in the sense of priority. But I think every one of us has experienced rejection in some form or the other. And that fear of rejection is what drives so much of our behavior as we interact in life. Does that make sense? So from the very onset, a big context to this whole text is the idea of rejection. And rejection in itself, I think, it strikes to the core of the soul. Because we were created for community. We were not created to be rejected. We were created for community. So when elements of our community reject us, it's not just striking at our ego, it's striking at our purpose. It's striking at our valuation of self-worth, right? It speaks to a lot. So we have these men. So you see Jesus walking along the shoreline as a rabbi, as the ideal, as rejected men, seeing the ideal that they wanted to be but couldn't, right? And at some point had received those words, you are not good enough to be a disciple. Just go raise men better than yourself. That's your whole goal now. Just go learn a trade and raise better men. But that's your purpose in life now, because you're not good enough to be this ideal. So when Jesus comes and gives the affirmative rabbinical statement or phrase of acceptance to discipleship, do you understand what that did for those men? Right? They heard more than just simply come and follow me. In fact, they heard, I wrote down 3 things that I think they heard. The first thing I think they would have immediately heard is that they are desired. One unique thing about the way Jesus is doing this, if you go back to the whole formulation, right? A midrash student would seek his rabbi and ask to be his disciple. Here you see the inverse. Right? These men didn't go ask Jesus to be his disciple. Jesus went to them and asked them to be his disciple. Right? And let's just kind of guard against any conceit in this, okay? God does not need us. Okay, he doesn't need us to accomplish anything that he wants to accomplish. Whether we participate in the kingdom or not, his will is going to get done, right? But that speaks to something then. So for him to actively go out and seek people to bring in to what Jesus is doing, if he doesn't need us, then that kind of leaves us with one thing. He wants us. He desires us. He wants us actively participating in what he has going on. Now, many of you may say, like, well, that sounds great, but, Ryan, you don't really know me or my history. You don't know about the affair I had a year ago. Or you don't know about the abortion I had in high school. Or you don't know how my temper gets out of control when I'm home talking with my wife and kids. Or you don't know about my alcohol or drug addiction or my porn problem or how I speak at work. Right? I don't think God really wants me to come forward and be his disciple. I think that goes into this other piece here. When a Midrash student was being interviewed, the rabbi was interviewing them not based off of who they were at that moment. What he was testing and trying to measure was the potential of the Midrash student to be something that he was not yet. You tracking with me? It was based off the potential that they had proven themselves at that point. And what you see also that's different from Jesus, notice how he doesn't give the typical preconditions of the ceremonial phrase of a rabbi. He doesn't say, Peter, man, you really know your Bible. Andrew, you know your theology, man. If I need to know what are the differences between Calvinism and Arminianism and dispensationalism, man, you had all the answers. He doesn't set any conditions. He just says, come and follow me. But I think that he still viewed potential. And I'm not sure if you look back down at your text, you'll see here in verse 19 and 21. But there's this interesting relation. The author once kind of noted that there's this relation to these brothers and the net. Okay, do you see that? So verse 19, it says that he saw them casting a net. Verse 21, he says he saw two other brothers, and they were in the boat, and they were what? Mending a net. So what we learn in Luke chapter 5 is that this was at the end. This was in the morning. So fishing on the Sea of Galilee occurred at night. There's like this one type of fish. It's like a tilapia variant, but you would fish for it at night. And what we learn is that they had an entire night of frustrating and disappointing fishing. Does anybody go fish? Yeah, like, those trips, right? You drive for hours, weekend, spend all that money, go to Bass Pro, you get all your gear, and you don't catch a single thing all weekend, right? And you're driving back like, why do I do this? Why do I do this, right? They had a very frustrating and disappointing night of fishing. And this is just a personal opinion, but I think when Jesus goes and he sees at the end of about a 12 to 13-hour fishing shift that was disappointing, that was frustrating, and he sees two brothers still casting that net to their purpose, I think what he saw was a different kind of potential. It wasn't about how much Bible they knew. It wasn't about what they knew. It was about the character of who they were that he saw. He says, man, life is going to be hard. Life is going to be frustrating. Ministry is going to be even more difficult. It's going to be even more disappointing and frustrating sometimes. I need men with the tenacity like that to continue casting that net even when they're frustrated, even when they're disappointed, even when it's been 12, 13 hours and they're exhausted. That's the kind of people that Jesus wants. Does that make sense? When you see, same thing when he sees James and John mending the net. Do you know what mending a net is? It's a very tedious process of examining and inspecting a net for gaps or vulnerabilities and then correcting it. It's very slow-moving, tedious work. And the same thing, at the end of a really long shift, they are making sure everything is good because it makes no sense to cast a net to catch fish if the net is compromised. So he looks at these men, he's like, man, that passion, that zeal to do things right, those are the kind of people I want. Not because of who they were at that moment, but at the potential that they had shown themselves to be. And I think Jesus says, man, if I could take that tenacity, if I could take that hard work, if I could take that attention to detail and apply that to my kingdom, man, we do incredible things. Does that make sense? He refocuses the potential and he says, I desire who you are. But he doesn't do the typical precondition. I think one of the elements of why that's also missing is because that every human being, wherever you are, you're accepted as a disciple of the potential that you've shown, that every human being possesses the potential to be a disciple of Christ. They can do it. So first thing they heard was that they were desired. The second thing they would have also heard is that they are enough. And I want to be careful with this as well, because they weren't enough for their own salvation. Okay, I want to keep this properly within its context. But what they would have heard is that we are enough based off of what we had previously been told, that we are not good enough to be a disciple. Jesus is telling them, you are good enough to be a disciple. You are good enough to come be like me. The whole element of discipleship, the midrash student, if he was accepted to be a rabbi, would then go and essentially be an apprentice under this rabbi for about 3 to 4 years. And the process of that was one of total emulation of their rabbi. There was actually this common phrase: if you were accepted to be a disciple, like if you went home and you said, Mom, Dad, the rabbi accepted me, I'm going to go be a disciple of Rabbi so-and-so. The phrase that they probably would have responded to you would have said, son, that's amazing. May you go be covered in the dust of your rabbi. The idea is that you would walk so closely behind your rabbi, that you would walk so, that you would emulate him in every regard, that even the dust that he kicks up from his sandals on the road just covers you. The idea of emulation was so strong that, like, the way your rabbi prayed is the way you would begin to pray. When he prayed, you would pray. When he ate, you would eat. What he ate is what you would eat. In every regard, you become like your rabbi. If you're walking along the road and he picks up a piece of straw and puts it in his mouth, you pick up a piece of straw and you put it in your mouth. This got to even the point that when your rabbi went to the restroom, you would go to the restroom. We talk a lot about being like Jesus in church. I've never heard it ever preached that we even need to be so much like him that we poop like Jesus. You know what I mean? Like, that was the level of emulation of what it meant to be a disciple. That you emulate them. So the idea isn't that they weren't good enough as where they stood. He's saying you are good enough to come emulate and learn under me. You get to be like me. If you copy and be exactly, just emulate me in all that I do, you are good enough to be like me. So they were desired, they were enough, but the third thing is that they were also valued. One of the central themes of Jesus' ministry is to show us that we are not who we think we are. And that's a spectrum, right? Two extremes of that, but we are not as smart as we think we are. We're not as powerful as we think we are. We are not as strong, and we are not as wise as we think we are. But on the other side of that, we're also not the garbage we feel ourselves to be sometimes. We took the youth to winter camp in February, and it would have been, I guess, after the Saturday morning chapel. And we took them to this place called Inspiration Point, and it just kind of overlooked the mountains. And the idea of the exercise was that they were going to take about 30 minutes to do some self-reflection. Really just think about their situation, where they stand with God, and what are some of the sins they're struggling with. And the whole idea was to prepare their hearts to repentance for later that night. Excuse me. So I'm in this talk. I'm driving home, like, you guys, like, you think you make a better God of your own life than God, and it's not true. I'm going on this whole thing. And one of the youth, she raises her hand and she says, well, what if it's the exact opposite? And I was kind of like, well, what do you mean? And she's like, well, I feel like I'm worthless. I feel like I'm not a God at all. I feel like I don't even belong here. And it took me back, and the other youth leaders and the youth in this room, as my witness, I asked, does anybody else feel that same way? We had about 60 kids. I'm not joking, about half the hands went up. And you see this reality, I think, not just among the youth, but I think would be very true of many in here, that they just hate themselves. They don't understand their value. They don't understand the calling that God has for them on their life and the value that brings them. Not just the value that they have something to offer, but that they themselves are valued. I'm going to introduce you to a concept because from the very beginning, all the way back in Genesis chapter 1 and creation week, what we see is that humanity was considered the crown of creation. That humanity was, God goes through and creates the land and the sea and the sky, and he fills it. And at the very end, out of himself, he formed man in his own image. So much of our value and worth is based off of the value and worth of our Creator. And then sin has slowly marred that image over time. And I think there is this almost internal sense of understanding and recognition that in our sin, we have marred the value of our image. You see this concept kind of play out in the sense that in the first 3 days of creation week, you see God form, right? He forms the land, and he forms the sea, and he forms the air. And then days 4 through 6, he fills it. And what you see is this concept of this, that God fills that which he forms. But the inverse of that is also this: he will not fill that which he hasn't formed. And what I've seen, I think, with a lot of people, I see it in the youth, I know it's true of even adult believers, is that you have formed an identity or an image. You've allowed social media, you've allowed the world, you've allowed broken people to form an identity and an image, and you're asking God to fill it. And God will not form that which not fill that which he hasn't formed. So the whole idea of coming in and emulating Christ, he says, come emulate and be like me, be my disciple, and I will reform you in my image. Because as you are reformed in my image, then I will fill you with my spirit. But some of you are going around thinking you're trash. You've almost given yourself the rejection phrase of the rabbi saying, I am not good enough to be a disciple, so I'm just going to go learn a trade. I'm going to go try to provide for my family. I'll try to honor the Bible the best that I can, but my whole goal in life is just to raise my sons and daughters to be better than me because I'm not it. And we formulate these identities that are broken. And we think ourselves to be trash, and God says, I'm not going to fill that identity because that's not how I formed you. Come be my disciple, emulate me, I will reform you in my image because you don't understand how valuable you are. He does not fill that which he hasn't formed. So those three things, right, just from hearing, come follow me, you would have heard, these men would have immediately heard, I am wanted, I am enough, and I am valued. But then valued to what? Right? What am I good enough to go do? And that's when you get to what does his dust, to be covered in his dust, really call us to? And the first thing I wrote here is this: a redefined purpose. I want you to see in verse 19, he says that he sees him casting a net, for they were fishermen, and he says, come follow me, for I will make you what? Fishers, not fishermen, but fishers of men. He redefined a purpose. Another cool detail that you'll see here in the text is that the writer makes it clear what the disciples left. So you see Peter and Andrew, it says that they left the nets. James and John, it says, and then they left the boats and they left their father. It makes a point about what they left. I thought that was very interesting, and I was just thinking, like, well, what does the net then represent, right? It's the mechanism to go fish, and he says, hey, I will make you fishers of men. I will bring you out. You're going to do the same purpose, but it's redefined a bit, not towards fish, but towards men. So they drop their net and go follow him. And I just kind of wrote this down, just my thoughts, but the nets represented not just the security, right? That was their means of security and making money, but it was ultimately represented their purpose. So by dropping the net, they are dropping their old purpose to go step into their new redefined purpose in following Jesus. When you look at James and John, it says that they left the boats and their father. Well, what did the boats and the father mean? What do those represent? I just wrote old attachments. I know it sounds kind of harsh of like my father's here right here, Deuce's dad. But the idea was that he left the previous attachments that they had to step into this calling. I feel like many people, and maybe it is you today, have accepted the call, but you haven't been being covered in the dust of your rabbi because you're holding on with a tight grip onto your boat. Whatever you're trying to leave, right? Those old previous attachments, whether it's sin, whether it's commitments, whatever it is. So I guess what I'm saying is the redefined mission doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get out of the Marine Corps and go be a missionary. It could mean that, but it doesn't have to mean that. What it means is that he's going to redefine the priorities of your life. He's going to redefine those inclinations within you, the passion within you to be applied towards different things beyond just making money and trying to get as much fish as possible, right? You can still go fish, but you're more concerned about God's kingdom than you are about catching fish. Does that make sense? His dust calls us to a redefined purpose. The second thing is his dust calls us to an urgency. Verse 20 and 22, you notice the word it uses? Immediately, for both of them. I don't know how well-versed you all are in the English language, but the term immediately means now. It doesn't mean later, okay? It doesn't mean later when you get out of 29 Palms, or later when you retire, or later when your kids get older, or later when you get your promotion, or later when you start making a little bit more money. It means now. So the calling of what the disciples would have heard as rejected men, that you are wanted, you are valued, you are enough, led them not just to a redefined purpose, but an urgency to jump into that purpose. An urgency we should all express ourselves. But it wasn't just a redefined purpose, and it wasn't just an urgency, but ultimately it was a joy. They urgently went into this purpose, not just simply out of obligation, but they joyfully did it. Can you imagine the joy these men felt after at some point in their life being told you're not good enough to be a disciple, to hear Jesus come and say, no, you are good enough to be mine, right? Living that entire life of rejection to then come and get this acceptance from, they didn't even know who he was then. It even magnifies it even more when you come to learn who Jesus was, right? At this particular time to them, he's just a rabbi. You know what I'm saying? Like they didn't even learn he's the Messiah yet. They didn't even learn that he's the Son of God. They had no resurrection yet, no crucifixion, none of that glory. He's just a rabbi. But that was enough for them just to be affirmed and validated that they are worth more than what they were told they were. You think about Zebedee. Zebedee at some point, Zebedee's in the boat with his sons when they get called. Zebedee himself would have also been called, hey, you are not good enough to be a disciple. Go home, go learn a trade, which is what he did. He went, he became a fisherman. Now he's teaching his own sons how to be fishermen. Go home, learn a trade, honor Torah, and raise men better than yourself. And I think this is another layer of an element of a father, that if you've been rejected that way, okay, I'm going to raise my sons then to be better than me, and then they get rejected. So now even the second purpose that they were given to raise better men to go be rabbis, he failed at that. So now to hear Jesus call his sons to go follow him as a rabbi, you understand what that probably did for Zebedee? He was probably like, go be covered in the dust of your rabbi, go. He was validated in that as well. I can almost guarantee you Peter's wife, when she heard the news, was probably like, well, this is kind of crazy. But I could tell you this, she was probably one really proud wife. She was probably one of those that has joins that very small Facebook group, right? Wives of the discipled, and has the bumper sticker, disciple's wife, toughest job in ministry. But she was probably happy, right? That substantially probably raised her standing in synagogue. Yeah, my husband was selected to go be a disciple. A disciple in that whole process was a big deal. So when we are called to be disciples of Christ, it is a big deal. We have kind of diluted it down a bit as just a church term. But in its actual context, it is supposed to be highly elevating for us. One that we are supposed to step into seriously and very really with the full focus to emulate our Rabbi in every element possible. We're to be covered in his dust. So this is what I want to kind of leave you with. And worship team, you can come on up. But I kind of started in the beginning with often our understanding kind of drives our behavior and our response. And I would say this, if you are not captivated by Jesus' call to be a disciple, you have either not understood the call correctly or you've been called by a different Jesus, right? So I don't know where you are in life and in terms of your spiritual walk. Some of you may have answered the call decades ago. And maybe you've been trying to live to that redefined purpose, but you haven't done it with the same sense of joy, or maybe you haven't done it with the same sense of value. That you've been doing it, but you've been doing it miserably because you think you're trash. I don't know what element of this may have spoke to you. Maybe you're someone who has never made that commitment in response to the call. But what my hope is for this morning is that if nothing else, you at least have come to a deeper appreciation to the calling you have received. And at the very least, maybe you start working with a little higher urgency to that calling than what you have been. I know I struggle with that all the time. If I believe what I believe and if it's true, and what you say you believe and it's true, am I working urgently enough in that truth?
Thank you for listening to the sermon. For further information or to get in contact with our church's ministries, please visit us at palmsbaptistchurch.com.